She took a job cooking for cowboys on a ranch, not knowing one of them owned the land they stood on. Have you ever been invisible to someone, only to realize later that they saw you all along? They just didn't know how to look at you without shame burning in their chest? Snow was falling hard over the Montana plains, thick as silence and twice as cold. December had sunk its claws deep into the land, frosting the brittle grass and clinging to the wooden beams of Stone River Ranch like old sorrow that refused to be forgotten. Wind screamed between the outbuildings, rattling loose shingles and stinging any skin foolish enough to show itself. The kind of wind that didn't just bite, it punished, testing every living thing to see who had the will to endure another brutal winter. Mara walked straight into it. Her coat was too thin, patched at the elbows with fabric that didn't quite match, and her gloves were mismatched, one wool, one leather, but her spine held straight as an iron rod, and her eyes burned with a kind of fierce defiance that only women with nothing left to lose ever truly mastered. A satchel hung from her shoulder, heavy with the few possessions she'd managed to keep through years of running, and her boots left sharp prints across the frozen mud of the ranch yard. Each step a declaration that she was here. She was real. She was not going to disappear. She stopped in front of the cookhouse where a group of cowboys were gathered near the open fire, passing a flask and laughing low through chattering teeth, their breath forming clouds in the frigid air. They looked up as she approached, the laughter fading one by one as they took in the sight of her. A woman, alone, asking for something in a place that gave nothing easily, that took everything and returned only survival. A tall man stepped forward, older than the rest, with a graying beard and suspicion etched deep into his brow like words carved in stone. His voice was gravel, wrapped in whiskey, rough and unforgiving. "This here's a working ranch, miss, not a place for strays or stories." "I am not a stray," Mara replied, her voice steady and low, carrying across the wind without wavering. "And I ain't here to tell stories." He looked her over with the kind of assessment that made women feel like livestock at auction, tallying up her worth in seconds and finding her lacking. "We ain't got use for trouble or liars or girls who think they can sweet-talk their way out of the cold." Mara's jaw set, her teeth clenching against both the wind and the insult. "I ain't here to sweet-talk neither." Another man, thicker, meaner in the eyes, with a face that suggested he enjoyed inflicting small cruelties, spat on the ground near her boots. "She looks like she come from a saloon kitchen, if not the back room." That brought a ripple of crude laughter, the kind men share when they think they're being clever, when they think a woman's past is fair game for entertainment. The first man raised a hand to silence it, though his expression suggested he'd found it amusing enough. He stepped forward until they were nose to nose, close enough that she could smell the tobacco on his breath and the judgment in his pores. "Well, what do you want?" Mara met his stare without blinking, without giving him the satisfaction of seeing her flinch. "I can cook," she said, her voice like flint striking steel. "I've worked cast iron over fire, skinned game, made sourdough in snowstorms, and soup out of bones. I can feed your men with what's left in the barrel and make them say thank you after." There was a pause, heavy and deliberate. The fire cracked behind them, sending sparks spiraling into the darkening sky. "Where you come from?" he asked, his eyes narrowing. Mara didn't answer. Her silence was its own fortress. He leaned in closer, testing her, probing for weakness. "This ain't no place for secrets." She lifted her chin, meeting his challenge with one of her own. "I know how to cook, and I'm not turning back." The man studied her a moment longer, weighing something in his mind, whether she'd be more trouble than she was worth, whether desperation made her dangerous or useful. Then he stepped aside and nodded toward the cookhouse, the gesture almost grudging. "We got 36 men through winter and no proper meals in 2 days. Stove's in there. You want the job? Prove it by morning." Mara didn't flinch, didn't show the relief that wanted to flood through her. "I'll need flour, salt, a dry towel, and a little respect. Wouldn't kill you." He grunted, half a laugh, bitter around the edges. "We'll see about that last part." As Mara stepped toward the door, her eyes passed over the group again, cataloging faces and finding them all variations of the same prejudgment. Most looked away, uncomfortable with sustained eye contact. Some smirked, already dismissing her. Others scowled, resenting her presence like she was a stain on their winter. But one man didn't move at all. He leaned against the post, arms folded across his chest, tall with a dark coat, and a brimmed hat pulled low, casting his face in shadow. The only thing visible was the sharp cut of his jaw and the flicker of something unreadable in his eyes, something that looked almost like recognition, almost like regret. He didn't speak, didn't scoff like the others, didn't join in the crude speculation. He just watched. Mara's gaze met his for a moment too long, long enough that something passed between them, not understanding, but acknowledgement. She saw him see her, truly see her, in a way the others hadn't. Then she pushed open the cookhouse door and stepped into her new reality. Inside it was dark, cold, and smelled of grease gone sour, of neglect and masculine indifference. Pots rusted on the sideboards, their surfaces thick with grime. A few empty tins lay scattered like fallen soldiers on a forgotten battlefield. But the stove stood tall in the corner, cast iron and solid, and Mara felt something like stubborn hope stir in her chest. Fragile, tentative, but alive. She hung her satchel on the hook, rolled up her sleeves despite the cold biting at her exposed skin, and began. If you're moved by stories of second chances and quiet redemption, take a moment right now to subscribe. Hit that like button and share this with someone who needs to hear that our past doesn't have to define our future. Your support helps us keep bringing you these powerful stories. Outside, the man in the dark coat, Cole Stone, kept his arms crossed, his body language closed, but his attention wholly focused on the cookhouse door. He had known her face before she spoke. He had seen her once in Billings years ago when she worked behind the kitchen doors of the Rosebell, that painted-up place where decent men whispered lies and left their honor outside with their horses. She had been dragged into the room one night, accused of stealing a drink, or maybe just standing too tall for a woman in her position. A man twice her size had grabbed her by the wrist with enough force to leave bruises that would last for weeks. She had not screamed, she had not cried, she had just stood there, spine like iron, eyes full of fire, daring them to strike her down if they meant to, refusing to give them the satisfaction of seeing her break. He had watched from the shadows that night, young and cowardly, his fists clenched at his sides but his feet rooted to the floor. He had done nothing, and now she was here, snow in her hair, defiance in every step, fate throwing them together like some cosmic joke, or perhaps divine punishment for his inaction. He said nothing to the others, offered no explanation for his silence. He just turned back toward the bunkhouse, the firelight flickering behind him, casting his shadow long across the snow. A storm was coming, outside and in, and it had her name written all over it. Mara rose before the moon had fled the sky, when the world was still caught between darkness and dawn, suspended in that liminal space where everything felt possible and nothing felt certain. The cold bit into her bones as she pulled on her boots and coat, the same threadbare one she had arrived in, offering protection that was more symbolic than practical. Snow had drifted against the cookhouse door overnight, and it took her shoulder and a hard push to open it, her muscles protesting the early hour and the harsh conditions. Inside, the air was somehow colder than outside, trapped and stagnant, until she got the stove going. She chipped ice from the water barrel with numb fingers, the sound sharp and lonely in the pre-dawn quiet. She fed the fire with pine kindling, watching the flames catch and grow, and waited until the heat began to chase the breath fog from the air. Her fingers stung with returning circulation. Her back ached from sleeping on a cot that was more board than mattress, but she moved like a woman who had lived through worse and planned to keep living, who had made survival into an art form. 15 cowboys meant 15 mouths to feed, 15 judgments to overturn through the simple act of competence. She mixed flour into stiff dough, her hands working with practiced efficiency, muscle memory from years of making something from nothing. She sliced thick strips of salted pork and fried them slow over cast iron, the smell beginning to fill the cookhouse with something that felt almost like home. The biscuits were hard-edged but hot, substantial and filling. She served them with coffee strong enough to wake the dead, black as sin and twice as necessary. At first the men muttered among themselves, voices low and suspicious. One asked where the real cook was, as if her presence was temporary, as if she was just keeping the seat warm for someone more legitimate. Another laughed too loud and said, "She must have poisoned the beans," trying to turn his nervousness into humor at her expense. But by the third morning, something had shifted. They came early to the benches, their boots stomping snow from their soles, their eyes seeking out the steam rising from the pots on the stove. They scraped their plates clean with the sides of their forks and passed the coffee pot like it was treasure, refilling their cups 2 and 3 times. No one praised her out loud. That would require admitting they'd been wrong about her, and pride was a hard thing to swallow. But they ate every crumb, and their silence spoke louder than words. Mara worked quietly, efficiently, with the kind of focus that comes from knowing your worth is being measured with every meal. She cleaned the pans herself, scrubbed the table until the wood grain showed through years of neglect, and even swept the ash from the corners of the cookhouse when no one asked her to. Cole was always there before the others. Every morning, without fail, he stepped into the cookhouse around the same hour, lifted the heavy logs into the firebox without being asked, and left without ceremony or expectation of thanks. She'd nod in acknowledgement. He'd tip his hat, barely, just a fraction of movement. He avoided her eyes with deliberate care, as if direct eye contact might reveal something he wasn't ready to confront. Mara noticed everything. She noticed that he spoke with the others easily enough, sat with them at meals, laughed at their jokes, participated in the rough camaraderie of ranch life. But with her, there was a silence, not the kind that spoke of judgment or disdain, but of distance, like he was holding something behind his eyes and didn't trust it to stay buried if she looked too long. And yet, he was the only one who carried an extra bucket of water without being told, appearing with it just as she was contemplating the long walk to the well in the bitter cold. He was the only one who left a new bar of soap by the wash basin when hers wore down to a sliver too small to be useful. He was the only one who straightened the step when it iced over, after he saw her slip once near the woodpile, catching herself just before she fell. It was a strange kindness, wordless but steady, consistent but unexplained, like he was trying to say something his voice couldn't manage. One evening, as the sun bled orange and purple across the snow-covered hills, Mara was hauling a bucket of melted snow across the frozen yard, her breath coming in clouds, her arms aching from the weight. Her boot caught on a slick patch of ice hidden beneath a dusting of fresh snow. She slipped hard, the world tilting suddenly, the bucket flying from her grip and water splashing across the white ground in a dark stain. The breath knocked out of her chest, pain spiking up her wrist as she hit the frozen earth with brutal force. She hissed, biting her lip hard enough to taste copper, determined not to cry out, not to give anyone the satisfaction of hearing her weakness. Before she could sit up, before she could even assess the damage, arms wrapped around her shoulders with surprising gentleness. "Mara!" Cole had crossed the yard in seconds, faster than she thought a man could move, as if he'd been watching from somewhere, and had started running the moment she fell. "You all right?" he asked, his voice low and urgent, threaded with concern that sounded almost painful. Mara blinked, disoriented by the sudden proximity. His face was close, framed by the dark brim of his hat, the dying light catching in his eyes and turning them almost amber. His hands were warm through his gloves, holding her steady with a care that contradicted his calloused exterior. She nodded once, her breathing shallow and uneven. "I'm fine." He helped her stand, one hand braced on her elbow, the other supporting her back with a touch so careful it made her chest ache with something she couldn't name. When she was upright and steady on her feet, he let go immediately and took a step back, as if he had crossed some invisible line and was trying to return before it cost too much, before someone noticed, before consequences materialized. Mara looked at him, really looked at him, searching his face for answers to questions she didn't know how to ask. He looked away, his jaw tight, his shoulders tense. "Thank you," she said quietly, the words inadequate but sincere. He only nodded, a sharp jerk of his chin, and turned back toward the barn without another word, his boots crunching through the snow with determined purpose. That night, as she sat near the stove cleaning her scraped palm with water that stung, she thought about the way he had looked at her, like she was someone he recognized but could not name aloud, like seeing her caused him pain and relief in equal measure. He had the air of a man keeping his distance not out of disdain, but out of fear, or maybe guilt, or maybe something more complicated that lived in the space between those emotions. Mara had known many kinds of silence in her life, the silence of judgment, the silence of indifference, the silence of men who looked at her and saw only what they wanted to see. But Cole's silence was different. It was loaded with intention, heavy with unspoken words, and she could not help but wonder what it was he was afraid to say, what truth he was holding back like a breath he couldn't release. It started with a whisper, as poison often does. Red Callahan, a brash young cowboy with a sharp tongue and a thirst for trouble that no amount of winter cold could quench, had ridden into town 3 days prior for supplies. When he came back, his saddlebags were heavy with flour and beans, but his mouth was heavier still with information he couldn't wait to share. He waited until supper, when the fire crackled in the gathering darkness, and the men had full bellies that made them lazy and receptive, before he leaned back on his elbows and said it like a joke, but with poison laced around the edges. "I seen her before," he said, nodding toward the cookhouse where Mara worked alone, visible through the window as she cleaned the dinner pots. "Back in Billings, at the Rosebell." The name settled over the camp like ash from a distant fire, coating everything it touched. Everyone knew the Rosebell, a brothel that posed as a saloon, sitting just off Main Street with velvet curtains, cheap whiskey, and girls who smiled whether they wanted to or not, who sold pieces of themselves to men who never bothered learning their names. Red smiled wide, his teeth yellowed from tobacco, his eyes gleaming with the cruelty of someone who enjoyed watching others squirm. She wore an apron then, too, always smelled of sage and smoke. She was the cook, sure, but you know how them girls get pulled upstairs once the whiskey runs low and the money runs out. The men chuckled, some uncomfortably, shifting in their seats and avoiding eye contact, others with that cruel ease born of boredom and bitter winters and the need to feel superior to someone, anyone. No one questioned Red, not really. They just let the words take root, spreading like infection through the group, changing the way they would look at her from that moment forward. Mara didn't hear it that night, insulated by the walls of the cookhouse and the sound of scrubbing metal against metal. But she felt it the next morning, like a change in atmospheric pressure, like a storm approaching that she couldn't see but knew was coming. The Cowboys filed into breakfast slower than usual, their movements hesitant, their faces carefully neutral. They didn't meet her eyes. The usual clatter of metal and voices was muted, replaced by an uncomfortable quiet that pressed down on the room like a physical weight. One man coughed, muttered something under his breath that she couldn't quite catch but recognized as judgment. Another set his plate down near the door, instead of at the table, maintaining physical distance as if whatever he thought she was might be contagious. They were polite on the surface, still said, "ma'am," when they took their coffee, still nodded when she served the biscuits, but they were no longer kind. The warmth that had been slowly building over weeks of good meals evaporated overnight, replaced by a cold politeness that hurt worse than outright hostility. And Mara knew. She knew that look, recognized it from a dozen towns and twice as many jobs. The sideways glances, the lowered voices that stopped when she entered a room, the way good men became strangers once they thought they knew a piece of your past, once they'd decided what kind of woman you were. She didn't say a word. She stirred the beans with steady hands, sliced the bacon with precision, served the coffee without spilling a drop. Her hands worked the same rhythm they always had, but her shoulders had stiffened imperceptibly, and the smile she sometimes wore, thin but genuine, was gone. Her eyes stayed low, focused on the work, on the only thing she could control. At noon, no one sat beside her near the fire when she took her brief rest. At dusk, no one asked if she needed help with the water buckets, though they'd watch her struggle with the weight and make no move to assist. And yet, she said nothing, because what could she say? She had worked at the Rose Bell. That much was true. She had cooked meals, cleaned dishes, survived in whatever way she could when her parents died, and left her with nothing but debt and hunger. She had not sold herself, but that distinction rarely mattered to the kind of men who looked at women like her and only saw one thing, who couldn't imagine that a woman might work in such a place and still maintain her dignity, still keep some essential part of herself untouched. Mara had learned long ago that defending yourself too hard only made you seem guiltier in their eyes, that explanations sounded like excuses, that the truth was often less important than the story people wanted to believe. So, she let them talk. She had survived worse whispers in darker places, and she would survive this too, because survival was what she did best. But Cole had heard it too. He had not laughed when Red made his comments. He had not looked amused or curious or entertained. He had gone completely silent, staring into the fire like it might explain something he had long been struggling with, like the flames might offer absolution he didn't deserve. And when that afternoon Red made another crude remark, something about leftover girls and leftover stew, trying to get another laugh from the group, Cole moved, no warning. No raised voice, no preamble, just a hard, fast punch that cracked against Red's jaw like thunder splitting the sky. Red hit the ground hard, spitting blood, his hands flying to his face in shock and pain. "What the hell is wrong with you?" he shouted, his voice muffled by his hands, his eyes wide with genuine confusion. Cole said nothing. He stood over Red for a breath, his chest heaving, his fists still clenched so tight his knuckles had gone white. Then he turned and walked away without explanation, without acknowledging anyone, including Mara, who had seen the whole thing from the shadow of the cookhouse door. She stood frozen, her dish towel still clutched in her hands, her mind struggling to process what had just happened and what it might mean. Why had Cole hit Red? Why now, after days of silence? Why not say something to her directly, explain himself, make his intentions clear? She didn't know if it was pity or guilt or something else she dared not name, some feeling more dangerous than either of those safer emotions. That night, snow began to fall again, soft and steady, like ash from a high place, like the sky was mourning something it couldn't articulate. Mara stayed up later than usual, too restless to sleep, too unsettled by the day's events. The kitchen was clean, every surface scrubbed, the stove banked low but still radiating gentle heat. She sat near its warmth, her fingers tight around a chipped mug of tea she had saved from her own meager wages, too precious to share. She didn't know what to make of what she had seen, of Cole's sudden violence on her behalf, of the way he'd looked at Red with something that went beyond anger into territory that looked almost like self-hatred. Was it pity? The thought made her stomach turn. She didn't want his pity, didn't need some cowboy feeling sorry for her past. Was it guilt? That seemed more likely, but guilt about what? Or was it something else entirely, something she was too afraid to hope for because hope had always been the thing that hurt her most, the weapon that life used against her most effectively? The knock came just past 10, so soft she almost missed it over the sound of wind against the windows. Mara stood slowly, her heart tight in her chest with apprehension and something that might have been anticipation, and opened the door. There was no one outside, just the snow falling in thick, lazy flakes, and the darkness pressing in from all sides. But on the stoop sat a small basket, dusted with white. Inside, a dozen brown eggs still warm from the henhouse, wrapped carefully in cloth to protect them from the cold. A sack of cornmeal tied tight with rough twine. A small jar of honey that caught the lamplight and glowed like captured sunlight. No note, no name, no explanation. But she knew. The eggs were from the roost near the barn, Cole's assigned chore, one he did every morning without complaint. The cornmeal bore the mark of the town general store, the same trip Red had returned from. Cole had gone too, she realized. He'd been in town and thought of her. Mara knelt in the doorway, brushing a flake of snow from the edge of the basket with fingers that trembled slightly, though whether from cold or emotion, she couldn't say. Her breath came out in clouds that dispersed into the night. The wind didn't bite as hard as before, or perhaps she was simply too focused on this small kindness to notice its teeth. She picked up the basket, cradled it close to her chest like something precious and fragile, and stepped back inside, closing the door against the winter night. For the first time in days, maybe weeks, maybe longer, she let herself smile. Just a little. Just enough. She didn't understand him, not yet, not completely, but maybe she didn't have to. Maybe understanding wasn't required for this first tentative step towards something that felt almost like trust. Tonight, someone had remembered her worth quietly, without demand, without expectation of gratitude or recognition. And that was enough. For now, that was everything. The fire in the bunkhouse had long since gone out, reduced to embers that glowed like distant stars, but Cole could not sleep. He lay on his cot, eyes open to the dark, listening to the wind thread through the gaps in the walls like whispered accusations, like voices from his past demanding answers he didn't have. Outside, snow drifted over the plains, soft and soundless, burying everything in white. But inside his chest, memory burned like a brand that never faded, never cooled, never gave him a moment's peace. He could still see her, 3 years ago at the Rose Bell in Billings. That night had never left him. It lived in his mind with perfect clarity, every detail preserved like insects in amber, unchanging and inescapable. They had gone to celebrate, his friends raucous and loud, drunk on whiskey and the thrill of closing a land deal with men twice their age, feeling like they'd finally arrived at something resembling success. Cole had not wanted to go, but he was younger then, quieter than he was now, and it had been easier to nod than argue, easier to follow than stand alone. He remembered the heavy perfume that cloyed in the throat, the stale air thick with bourbon and sweat and desperation, the piano playing out of tune in the corner, the forced laughter that didn't quite hide the emptiness underneath. And he remembered her. She had not looked like the others, no bright lipstick painting her mouth into something artificial, no hungry smile designed to separate men from their money, no practiced seduction in her movements. She wore an apron, her hair pulled back in a practical twist that suggested function over form. She carried a tray of drinks with quiet focus, weaving between tables like she was trying not to be seen, trying to make herself small and invisible in a place that thrived on spectacle. But then the floor had been wet. Someone had spilled whiskey and not bothered to clean it, and she slipped. The tray crashed, an explosion of sound in the crowded room. Liquor spilled across expensive boots. Glass shattered into pieces that caught the lamplight like scattered diamonds. One of the older men, some big-name merchant whose face Cole couldn't remember, but whose voice still echoed in nightmares, had roared with rage, his face turning purple with alcohol and anger. "You filthy saloon tramp," the man had spat, grabbing her arm with enough force to leave fingerprint bruises. "Think dressing like a lady makes you one?" Another man had grabbed the strings of her apron and yanked hard, trying to humiliate her, to put her in what he considered her place. She staggered, her hands shaking as she tried to gather the broken glass, tried to apologize, tried to make herself even smaller. But her eyes, Cole would never forget her eyes. They had looked right at them, at all of them, unflinching and defiant even as her hands trembled. There was fury in those eyes, and pain, and a kind of dignity that couldn't be stripped away no matter how hard they tried. And he had done nothing. Cole had stood there, his fists clenched at his sides until his nails bit into his palms, his mouth full of sand, his throat closed around words that wouldn't come. He was 23, just old enough to know what was right, and too cowardly to do it. He had watched, he had seen, he had recognized the injustice, and he had turned away, following his friends out into the night, leaving her to clean up the mess and endure whatever other humiliations the night would bring. He saw her then. He remembered her now. The same woman who now rose at dawn to cook meals for men who wouldn't meet her gaze, who scrubbed the cookhouse with aching hands, who never asked for thanks or recognition, who carried herself with that same unbreakable dignity despite everything life had thrown at her. Cole sat up, swinging his legs over the side of the cot with sudden decision. The wood floor was cold beneath his feet, making him gasp. He pulled on his coat, stepped into boots he didn't bother to lace, and walked out into the wind. The cold hit him like a physical blow, stealing his breath, but he welcomed it. Welcomed anything that felt like punishment, like penance, like payment for old sins. He walked slowly across the snow-covered yard toward the cookhouse, his hands shoved deep in his pockets, his head bent against the wind. The light inside was dim, but still glowing, a warm yellow glow against the darkness. He knew she stayed up late, fixing what could be mended, salvaging what others would throw away, refusing to waste anything because waste was a luxury she'd never been able to afford. He crouched and laid a bundle of dry wood on her stoop, careful to arrange it so it wouldn't get buried by drifting snow. No note, no knock, no expectation of acknowledgement. But tonight, he did not walk away immediately. Instead, he stepped behind the red brush growing near the edge of the wall, half dead from winter but still providing enough cover, and watched through the faint opening in the canvas curtain that served as her window. She sat near the stove, mending the frayed shoulder of her work shirt, her brow furrowed with concentration, her fingers careful and quick despite the dim light. There was something almost sacred in her stillness, in the way she focused on the simple task of repair, treating the worn fabric with the same care others reserve for precious things. The world had always hurt her. That much was clear in the careful way she moved, in the walls she'd built around herself, in the defiance that never quite masked the pain underneath. But she still met it with quiet dignity, still refused to let it break her completely, still found ways to survive with her essential self intact. Cole felt shame rise again, thick and bitter in his throat, choking him with its familiar taste. In her he saw everything he had once lacked: courage, pride, survival instinct, the strength to stand tall when the world demanded you kneel. He had stood by once, a spectator to her suffering. He would not do it again. He would find a way to make it right, even if it took the rest of his life, even if she never knew, even if redemption was impossible, and all he could offer was the quiet service of carrying wood and leaving gifts in the darkness. Inside the cookhouse, Mara paused in her mending, her needle frozen mid-stitch. She stared at the flame for a long moment, her mind drifting to places she usually kept locked away, then bent back down to her work, her shoulders tight with tension. She couldn't quite release. She remembered him too. Though she'd never said it aloud, never acknowledged the recognition that had sparked when she first saw him at the ranch. She had seen him that night in Billings, not up close, but from across the room, standing in the shadows near the door. She'd seen him watching when that merchant had grabbed her, had felt his eyes on her humiliation, had experienced one brief, foolish moment of hope that someone might speak for her, might step forward and say that what was happening was wrong. But he hadn't. He'd just watched, his face unreadable in the lamplight, and then he'd left with his friends, disappearing into the night like all the others who witnessed injustice and chose comfort over courage. She had not hated him for it, not exactly. Hatred required energy she couldn't spare, focus she needed for survival. But she had resented the hope, brief and foolish as it was, that someone might be different, that someone might see her as human rather than commodity. And yet, since she had come to Stone River Ranch, it was Cole who helped her lift the heavy water pots without being asked, who chopped extra wood for her fire, who left things on her stoop in the darkness without ever asking for thanks or acknowledgement. He never said a word about that night, never referenced their shared history, never explained his motives. But he never walked away either. He showed up day after day with his quiet assistance and his careful distance, like he was trying to atone for something without ever naming the sin. Mara's heart beat heavy in her chest, weighted with emotions she didn't want to examine too closely. She did not know what to make of him. This man who had failed her once and now seemed determined to serve her in silence. And maybe she did not want to know, did not want to crack open that particular truth and see what lived inside it, because hope was the most dangerous thing she could allow herself, and forgiveness might cost more than she had to give. But then the fire came. That same night, as snow began to fall in heavier flakes and the wind picked up with renewed fury, a gust from the north swept through camp with unusual force. Someone had stacked dry timber too close to the rear of the cookhouse, a violation of basic safety that no one had bothered to correct, because men got lazy when days were short and cold was constant. A stray ember from the stove, too small to notice, had been carried by the draft and caught the pile. Within minutes, flame roared up the wall, crackling like fury set loose, hungry and indiscriminate. Yelling broke through the night, shattering the quiet. Men scrambled from the bunkhouse, half-dressed and disoriented. Someone banged on doors with frantic fists. Voices called out in panic and confusion, But Mara, exhausted from another long day of work and emotional turmoil, had fallen asleep on her cot near the stove, the warmth and the rhythm of the wind lulling her into a deeper sleep than usual. She did not stir until Cole came. He did not wait, did not stop to assess the danger or calculate the risk or think about his own safety. He crashed through the smoke that was already filling the cookhouse, pulled his coat over her face to protect her from the heat and fumes, and lifted her in his arms like she weighed nothing. He turned his back to the fire as flames licked down the wall behind them, as sparks caught on his sleeves and burned through the fabric to his skin. The heat seared his cheek, made his eyes water, but he held her close and did not stop, did not hesitate, did not loosen his grip for even a second. When she awoke coughing against his chest, her eyes opened to find his face impossibly close, impossibly raw. He looked down at her, and in that gaze there was no shame, no memory of who she had been or where they had met. There was only the now, the girl he had once failed and the woman he refused to fail again. In his arms, with smoke still stinging her lungs and fear still racing through her veins, Mara saw something in his eyes that took her breath away more effectively than any smoke. Not pity, not guilt, not even obligation. Just a fierce, desperate need to protect her, to keep her safe, to prove through action what his words had never been able to express. And in that moment, something shifted between them, something fundamental and irreversible, like a door opening that could never be fully closed again. The days grew colder, if such a thing was possible, and the snow packed tighter over the hills like white wool stitched into the earth with threads of ice. Each morning, before the bunkhouse stirred, before the sun had even thought about rising, Cole came to the cookhouse. He would mumble something about needing coffee or checking the firewood, excuses that fooled no one, least of all Mara, but she never called him on it, never pointed out the transparent nature of his visits, because she had come to depend on them in ways she didn't want to examine too closely. His eyes always drifted toward the small black kettle on the back burner, the one she filled with leftover soup from the night before, not the watery stuff she served the men, but the richer version she made for herself with the scraps they discarded, the bones they thought had nothing left to give. Every time he came in, his hand would hover just for a breath, then curl around the warm handle of the tin cup she had filled exactly 3 minutes before his arrival, timed with precision born of daily repetition. He never thanked her aloud. She never pointed out that it had been poured before he walked through the door. It was a strange dance they were doing, unspoken but not unnoticed, building something neither was quite ready to name. Mara had begun keeping a small ledger tucked under the flour sacks, hidden from casual view. It wasn't for numbers or accounts, but for memories made tangible through recipe and instruction. Her mother's handwriting, once scribbled on scraps of linen and paper, now faded from age and handling, was slowly being copied by Mara's own calloused hands into neat, determined lines. Cornbread without sugar, the way Mama made it when sugar was scarce. Beef stew with root vegetables that could make a meal from almost nothing. Molasses pudding thick enough to make a cowboy sit still and savor. They were recipes, yes, but more than that. They were dreams made concrete, possibilities written down, where she could see them and believe they might someday be real. One day, perhaps, a little place of her own. A kitchen without shame attached to it, without whispers following her through doors. A sign that said welcome and meant it. That invited people in without judgment or prerequisites. She was stirring a pot of onion broth, the smell rich and comforting in the warm space, when Cole stepped in again, snow dusting his shoulders like powdered sugar. "Coffee's hot," she said without looking up, her voice casual, giving him the out he always took. He nodded, moved toward the counter with his usual economy of motion, and picked up the tin cup already waiting. Steam curled from the rim, dancing in the lamplight. He sipped quietly, standing near the stove, soaking in the warmth. After a moment, she asked without turning, keeping her voice carefully neutral, "What did you used to think I was?" The question hung in the air between them, heavy with implication. He paused, the cup halfway to his lips, then slowly set it down on the counter with deliberate care. "I thought you were strong," he said finally, his voice low. "Even when I first saw you at the Rose Bell, you didn't flinch. You stood there like you had every right to exist, even when they were trying to convince you otherwise." She stopped stirring, her hand frozen mid-motion. He added, quieter, "But I also thought you were afraid." "Of you?" she asked, the words barely above a whisper. "Of myself," he said, the admission clearly costing him something. "Afraid of what it said about me that I stood there and watched. Afraid I was no better than the men who laughed." The silence that followed was not cruel or accusatory. It was heavy with history, weighted with shared memory, but not unkind. Then he said, each word deliberate, "I've thought of that night every day since." She turned finally, her eyes finding his across the space that suddenly felt both too large and too small. "Why tell me now? "Because I owe you more than soup and split wood and eggs left on doorsteps," he said, his voice rough with emotion. He wasn't trying to hide anymore. "Because silence felt like cowardice, and I've been a coward long enough." Mara stepped forward, wiping her hands on her apron with careful, deliberate movements. "Is this what you do?" she asked, studying his face. "Carry guilt and hope it turns into redemption?" Cole winced as if she'd struck him. "I don't know what I'm doing. I just know I want to be something better than I was." She studied him. This man who had become less of a mystery and more of a question, complex and contradictory, and somehow more honest in his flawed humanity than anyone else she'd known. And maybe that was why she asked, her voice gentler than before. "So, who are you now? Really?" He hesitated, weighing something in his mind, then exhaled slowly, the breath carrying the weight of a secret he'd been holding too long. "I'm Cole Stone." Mara blinked, the name registering slowly. "Stone as in Stone River Ranch?" He nodded, his jaw tight. "My father owns it. Built it from nothing, turned it into something substantial. I was raised here, learned to work horses before I could read. But I left after the war, needed to get away from expectations and legacy and the weight of a name I didn't feel I'd earned." He paused, looking down at his hands, rough, scarred hands that bore the marks of real labor. "I came back last spring and asked him not to tell the men who I was. I wanted to work alongside them, not above them. Wanted to earn my place through what I could do, not who my father was." Mara's face went still, her expression unreadable. "So, all this time," she said, her voice low and controlled, "you've been watching from behind a mask." "No," he said quickly, stepping closer, urgent now. "I've been trying to earn your truth with mine, trying to be someone worthy of—" He stopped, the sentence unfinished, but its meaning clear. She shook her head, backing away, her defenses rising. "You men, you all wear faces, pretend to be better than the last. But you're still watching, still deciding what a woman is worth based on her past instead of who she is." "Not you," Cole said firmly, his voice carrying conviction. "Never you." Her breath hitched, emotion threatening to overwhelm the careful control she'd maintained. "Then why lie?" "I didn't lie," he said softly, searching her face. "I just didn't lead with a name that never fed a horse or built a fire or meant anything without the work behind it. I wanted you to see me for who I am, not what I own." She looked away toward the window where snow continued its endless fall. Outside, the storm had stopped, but the cold pressed closer, invasive and unrelenting. Mara turned back to the stove, picked up the ladle, and stirred the soup again, giving her hands something to do, giving herself time to think. Cole waited, not pushing, barely breathing. Finally, she ladled some broth into a bowl and set it on the table. "It's hotter than before," she said, her voice carefully neutral, "but it cools fast." He sat slowly, understanding the metaphor, taking the spoon in hand, with a gentleness she hadn't expected. His eyes meeting hers with unguarded honesty, he said, "So do most things worth waiting for." Mara said nothing, but she did not leave the room, did not turn away, did not close the door he was trying so carefully to open. And in that silence, something fragile began to take root. Not trust, not yet, but the possibility of it, which was perhaps more valuable for being so rare in her experience. The dawn was a pale smear across the snow, barely breaking the long shadow of the ridge, when Mara packed her things into her canvas satchel. Her hands moved in practiced silence, folding her one spare apron with precise creases, tying a scarf around her hair, with motions perfected through countless departures, tucking the leather-bound cookbook beneath her arm like the treasure it was. She left the fire untended. The coals cold from the night before, a symbol of endings she'd grown too familiar with. Her boots crunched softly as she crossed the frozen yard in the pre-dawn darkness. The bunkhouse was still quiet, the men lost in sleep and dreams. Even the horses had not begun their restless stamping. Just whine whispering like regret made audible, carrying the scent of snow and endings. Mara paused by the cookhouse door, her gaze sweeping the porch where Cole sometimes stood before sunrise, pretending to sip coffee while actually just existing in her proximity. There was no sign of him now. She let out a breath that clouded white in the frigid air. Her heart didn't ache. Aching suggested something gentle, something manageable. This was different. It burned like something was being torn from bone, like a part of her was being left behind whether she wanted to leave it or not. Inside, the shelves still held her jars of pickled onions, her spices wrapped in waxed paper, a loaf of bread cooling too slowly to matter now. The space bore her fingerprints, her labor, her care. But it was not hers. It never had been. This had always been someone else's ranch, someone else's fire, someone else's dream. She was just passing through, as she always had been, as perhaps she always would be. She left her key, just a bent nail on a string, hooked beside the stove where the next cook would find it, and she walked out into the waiting morning. Cole did not sleep that night. Snow had started falling again, dry and restless, flitting in thin flurries that caught in his hair and melted down the collar of his coat in cold rivulets that made him shiver. He stood outside the dark cookhouse for hours, a solitary figure in the darkness, watching the smokeless chimney, the still windows, the absence of light that meant she was either sleeping or had already gone. He had said nothing when she left, not because he did not want to stop her, every fiber of his being screamed to run after her, to beg her to stay, but because he knew how many men had tried to trap her with soft words and false promises. He would not be another man who caged her with expectation, who loved her with conditions, who saw her as something to possess rather than someone to choose freely. Instead, he stayed up, hollowed by silence, thinking of everything he should have said and never did, all the words that had died in his throat over weeks of careful distance. The fire in his chest was not just guilt anymore. It was the ache of a man who had come too late with too little, who had finally found something worth holding on to, only to realize his hands were still stained with the cowardice of his past. When the snow thickened, turning the world into a study in white and gray, he finally turned inside, his joints stiff from cold and stillness. He sat at the narrow table Mara had scrubbed clean every morning, his fingers tracing the wood grain she'd revealed through patient labor, and reached for the old book she always kept near the flour sacks, her mother's recipes, her dreams bound in leather and paper. He hesitated, knowing this was private, sacred, not meant for eyes like his. But then he tore a page from the back, a blank one, she had so few of those left, and began to write. The letter was short, but it cost him more than anything he had spoken aloud, each word extracted with painful honesty. If I were someone else, if time could be rewound like thread on a spool, I would be the man who knelt to wipe that floor for you, not the man who watched and turned away. You stood taller than I ever have. You still do. I do not ask you to forgive me, only to know this. When you stepped into my life, it was the first time I felt warm in years. Not because of what you could give me, but because of who you are, the woman who makes something from nothing, who survives when survival seems impossible, who carries dignity like armor and kindness like a secret weapon. I was a coward once. I am trying not to be one now. Cole. He folded the letter carefully, his hands shaking slightly, and slid it inside the front cover of her cookbook. Then he left it on the edge of the kitchen table, positioned where she would not miss it if she ever came back, if fate was kinder than he deserved, if hope was something more than a word. But he did not expect her to return, not after everything, not after him. Mara found the letter on the third night. She had made it only as far as the boarding house in town, her savings just enough for 1 week's cot and cold tea, barely enough to keep the hunger at bay while she figured out her next move. The cookbook had been tucked into her bag, unread, unopened, too precious to risk losing, but too painful to look at in those first raw days. Until now. She had been trying to rewrite a soup recipe on the last page, trying to focus on the familiar ritual of recording food memories, when she felt the thin edge of paper slide free from the front cover. She unfolded the letter slowly, her hands unusually clumsy, and read it once, then twice, then a third time, each reading revealing new layers, new meanings in the carefully chosen words. She pressed it to her chest and closed her eyes, her breath hitching with emotion she'd been holding back since leaving. Outside, the wind howled against the thin window panes, rattling them in their frames. Snow screamed like a storm without end, like winter had forgotten how to be anything but brutal. But inside her, something softened, not the pain, that would take time, but the belief that maybe, just maybe, not every man was too late. Some just needed a fire they could not ignore to show them the way forward. Some needed to fail before they could learn to stand. And some, rare as they were, needed to be loved by a woman who knew her worth before they could understand what they'd almost lost. Mara folded the letter carefully, tucked it back into the cookbook for safekeeping, and stared at the small lamp flickering on the bedside table. Tomorrow, she would make a decision. Tonight, she would let herself hope, just a little, just enough to make tomorrow possible. The sun spilled gold over the Montana plains 2 years later, soft and slow, warming the wood beams of a small building nestled beside the old trail, once used by cattle drives, now leading to something gentler. A carved sign swayed above the door in the breeze. Mara's table. The front porch was wide, welcoming, with benches where old cowboys smoked their pipes and children giggled over biscuits with jam, where townspeople gathered to share gossip, and travelers stopped to rest weary feet. Inside, the air always smelled like cinnamon and smoked pork, like bread fresh from the oven and coffee that could wake the dead. The walls held shelves of books and jars of preserves in jewel tones that caught the light. The long wooden counter held a fresh pie every morning, apple, cherry, whatever fruit was in season, and behind it, always, was Mara. Her hands were firm and capable, Her laughter came easy now, rising from somewhere deep and genuine. She no longer flinched at raised voices or loud boots, no longer tensed when men entered her space. She wore her apron with pride, the fabric clean and pressed, embroidered along the hem with flowers she'd stitched herself during quiet evenings. She kept a painted tin by the window labeled Dreams, where she taught local girls to save what little they had for something that mattered, passing on the lesson she'd learned through painful experience. Outside, Cole worked in the herb garden he'd planted the first spring, his sleeves rolled up despite the morning chill, hands thick with soil that stained under his nails. He spoke to the basil like an old friend, his voice low and conversational, and trimmed the tomatoes with the care of a man who knew what it meant to start over, to build something from ruins, to tend growth with patience. He still did not speak much in crowds, still carried that essential quietness that had always defined him. But when he looked at Mara through the window as she served customers, or across the table at dinner, or in the soft light of morning, it was without shame or shadow. He looked at her with wonder, as if he still couldn't quite believe his luck, as if every day with her was a gift he hadn't earned, but was determined to deserve. Every Saturday, children from the village gathered by the back door, their faces eager, their hands already flour-dusted in anticipation. Mara taught them how to knead dough, the rhythm and pressure required to make it elastic and alive, how to tell when oil was too hot by the way it shimmered, how to laugh when flour landed in your hair instead of crying about the mess. She told stories while she stirred the stew, not about her past, but about possibilities, about how food could be love made visible, about how the act of feeding someone was its own kind of grace. Sometimes travelers would stop in, drawn by reputation or simple hunger. A stranger, catching wind of the place through word-of-mouth recommendations, would lean across the counter and ask, genuine curiosity in their voice, "Ma'am, you sure do cook like you've been doing this forever. Where'd you learn?" Mara would wipe her hands on her apron, glance at Cole as he sliced onions behind her, with the practiced ease of someone who'd done it 1,000 times, and smile, a real smile, the kind that reached her eyes and transformed her face. "I used to cook for people who never knew my name," she'd say simply, "but now I cook for a man who looks me in the eye and sees who I really am." And that was enough explanation. No one asked again, sensing that the story underneath was both more complicated and more private than casual conversation allowed. The day of their wedding had been small, intimate, perfect in its simplicity. The meadow was quiet, lit by late spring sun that turned everything golden. Wildflowers nodded in the breeze like silent witnesses. The grass was new and green, winter finally relinquishing its hold. Mara wore a dress she had sewn herself through long winter evenings, her fingers cramping but determined. Nothing fancy, just cream linen with careful stitching, and a blue ribbon Cole had found washed up in an old drawer, faded but beautiful. He wore his best shirt, the one he saved for occasions that mattered, and his quiet smile, the one that said more than words ever could. They stood beneath a crooked oak tree, its branches spreading wide like arms offering shelter, with 2 witnesses and a preacher who barely cleared his throat before beginning the simple ceremony. But the vows themselves lingered longer than any sermon, spoken in voices rough with emotion and absolute in their certainty. At the end, Cole reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a handkerchief, not lace or silk, nothing expensive or showy, just soft cotton worn smooth by time and care. On it, embroidered in faded red thread with stitches that showed their age, was a single word: forgiven. He tied it gently around Mara's wrist like a vow that needed no voice, like a promise that transcended language, his fingers trembling slightly as he secured the knot. She looked up at him, her eyes bright with something that had nothing to do with tears. Joy, perhaps, or maybe relief, that the long journey had finally brought her here, to this moment, to this man who had learned to be worthy of her. "Thank you," she whispered, the words inadequate but heartfelt. He shook his head, his own eyes suspiciously bright. "No," he said firmly. "Thank you. For staying when I gave you every reason not to. For seeing past who I was to who I was trying to become. For teaching me that redemption isn't something you earn once. It's something you choose every single day." They turned together toward the trail, hand in hand, sunlight catching the embroidery on her wrist and making it glow like a brand, like a mark of belonging. They had no need to run anymore, no need to hide or apologize or explain themselves to anyone. They had built something together that could not be burned, not by fire, not by shame, not by memory, not by the cruelty of strangers or the weight of the past. And that was the beginning of everything. Thank you for joining us on this journey through the smoke of old kitchens, the silence of regret, and the quiet grace of redemption that comes not from forgetting the past, but from choosing who we become despite it. Mara and Cole's story reminds us that the past does not define who we are, only what we choose to become in spite of it, that love, real love, does not ask for perfection, only truth, and the courage to stand beside it when standing is the hardest thing you can do. If this story moved you, there are more waiting to be told. Subscribe to Wild West Love Stories for unforgettable tales of grit, passion, and second chances. Stories set in a land where the wind speaks of old scars and every heart has a frontier worth crossing. Hit that subscribe button, ring the bell, and ride with us into territory where love ain't always pretty, but it's always worth fighting for. The end.